The city, a symphony of chaos, hummed outside Elara Vance's window, a relentless percussion of car horns, distant sirens, and the muffled roar of the subway. But inside her small, sun-drenched apartment, nestled amidst towering stacks of sheet music and a scattered collection of bows, there was only one sound that truly mattered: the vibrant, living pulse of her violin. At 24, Elara wasn't merely a musician, she was an extension of the instrument itself, her slender frame a conduit for the melodies that flowed through her. Her fingers, long and elegant, danced across the strings with a surgeon's precision, each movement a whispered secret, a tender caress that coaxed raw emotion into existence. Her eyes, the color of twilight, held a serene intensity, perpetually searching, listening, absorbing the unseen nuances of sound, as if privy to a language only she could truly comprehend. She spoke little, her words often feeling inadequate, clumsy compared to the soaring eloquence of a minor chord or the melancholic lilt of a cello's lament. Her true voice resonated in the rich, resonant tones of her instrument, a language understood universally, felt profoundly. Her dream wasn't a superficial yearning for fame or the blinding glare of spotlights. It was a visceral, almost spiritual craving to stand on the grandest stages of the world, Carnegie Hall, the Berlin Philharmonie, the Sydney Opera House, and to feel the sheer, unadulterated force of the music reverberate through every cell of her being. She envisioned the vibrations, a tangible current coursing from the polished wood of her violin, through her chin, down her spine, and out into the vast, hushed auditoriums. She didn't want to play music. She yearned to become music, to dissolve into the harmony, to exist as nothing more than pure, unadulterated sound. This was her purpose, her singular obsession, the very core of her existence. Every waking moment was a dedication, a silent vow to this profound connection. She meticulously practiced, hours blurring into days, her calloused fingertips a testament to her devotion, her mind a fortress of intricate musical theory and soaring compositions. Elara's world was a tapestry woven from sound. She moved through the city not just seeing, but hearing its rhythm, the staccato of footsteps on pavement, the legato of a distant train, the crescendo of a bustling market. Her favorite haunts were sanctuaries of sound, the hushed reverence of rehearsal, studios, where the air hummed with anticipation, the smoky intimacy of dimly lit jazz clubs where improvisation danced on the air like a fleeting dream, and her own apartment, a sanctuary overflowing with the silent promise of melody. Music wasn't merely a backdrop to her life, it was the very air she breathed, seeping into the very walls, an omnipresent force guiding her every beat, every breath. Each step she took had a subtle rhythm, each gesture a silent note in her personal symphony. Her circle was small but fiercely loyal, comprised of fellow musicians who understood the silent language of dedication and the intoxicating pull of creation. They saw not just a prodigy, but a soul laid bare by her art. Among them, Maestro Ivanov stood as a monolithic presence, a mentor whose exacting standards bordered on obsession. He saw in Elara a reflection of the perfection he had chased but never quite grasped, treating her not as a student, but as a precious, fragile fragment of pure, unblemished genius. His words were few, his gaze often piercing, yet in his silent nods and the subtle flex of his jaw, Elara understood the immense pride and expectation he held for her. He pushed her relentlessly toward the precipice of her potential, recognizing that her greatest strength, her unwavering, almost painful perfectionism, and her complete absorption in music, was also the fragile fulcrum upon which her entire world balanced. Yet, despite the intense demands of her craft, there were moments of pure, unadulterated joy. The thrill of a flawlessly executed passage, the shared glance with a fellow musician in perfect sync, the quiet satisfaction of a new composition taking shape under her bow. These were the moments that solidified her conviction, moments when the music transcended mere sound and became a tangible force of happiness, a vibrant affirmation of life. She felt utterly alive, exquisitely attuned to the world, ready to conquer any challenge that stood between her and the realization of her ultimate dream. This was Elara Vance, a soul inextricably linked to the ebb and flow of sound, a young woman poised on the brink of realizing a destiny crafted from melody and dedication. The world was her orchestra, and she, its most devoted soloist, ready to conduct her magnum opus. But as we often learn, the most beautiful symphonies are sometimes punctuated by the most unexpected, shattering silences. Consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss more stories of incredible human resilience, just like Elara's. The first whisper of silence wasn't a sudden, deafening blow, but an insidious, almost imperceptible fading, like a distant radio signal slowly losing its strength. It began with the high notes, a shimmering, ethereal quality to her violin's upper register that Elara suddenly couldn't quite grasp, a subtle dulling she initially dismissed as fatigue or an off day. Then the nuances began to vanish. The rich vibrato of a cello, the sharp attack of a trumpet, the delicate echo of a piano's sustain. Pedal. Her world, once a vibrant tapestry of interwoven sounds, started to unravel thread by thread. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her carefully constructed calm. She'd strain, pressing her ear to the violin, plucking a string, but the familiar resonance felt distant, muffled, as if a thick pane of glass had been placed between her and the music. The diagnosis came like a sledgehammer. A rare, aggressive autoimmune disease, its name a string of complex medical jargon. That meant nothing to Elara. What mattered was the chilling pronouncement. Her hearing was deteriorating rapidly, irreversibly. Weeks, the doctor said, his voice a low, sympathetic murmur that Elara could barely distinguish from the hum of the air conditioner. Weeks until complete, profound deafness. The words echoed in her mind, a monstrous, silent roar that drowned out everything else. It wasn't just her hearing, it was her very essence, her language, her connection to the world, being systematically stripped away. Each passing day brought a new layer of silence, a new piece of her identity crumbling. The city's symphony outside her window became a muted hum, then a whisper, then nothing. The intricate melodies she knew by heart, the ones that lived in her bones, began to recede, becoming ghosts of sound, phantom vibrations in a deafening void. The morning she awoke to absolute silence was a descent into a living nightmare. There had been no gentle transition, no lingering echo, just an immense, suffocating absence. She sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against her ribs, straining to hear the familiar chirping of birds, the distant rumble of traffic, anything, nothing. Only the rush of blood in her own ears, a mocking internal ocean of sound she couldn't escape. Her violin lay on its stand in the corner, a silent sentinel, its polished wood gleaming mockingly in the morning light. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and drew the bow across the strings. She saw the strings vibrate. She felt the wood hum against her cheek, but heard nothing. Not a note, not a whisper, just the chilling, profound emptiness. It wasn't merely the loss of sound. It was the loss of her soul's anchor. The hospital room, when she finally succumbed to the doctor's insistence, was sterile, quiet, and filled with a suffocating pity that Elara found unbearable. Her family, their mouths moving, faces contorted in sorrow she couldn't interpret, felt miles away, speaking a foreign language of grief. Maestro Ivanov stood by her bed, his usual intensity replaced by a haunted pallor. He didn't speak, but his eyes, usually so sharp and demanding, now held an unbearable sadness. He left a stack of blank sheet music on her bedside table, a silent, cruel joke that twisted her gut. She turned her face to the wall, shrinking into herself. The silence outside her ears now mirrored by a deafening silence within. The initial shock gave way to a consuming, suffocating grief. Her apartment, once a haven of musical exploration, became a tomb. The instruments that had been extensions of her being now felt like painful reminders, accusing monuments to a lost life. The violin, her beloved companion, lay untouched, a polished, silent corpse. She tried to pick it up, to feel the vibrations, to remember, but the lack of sound was a physical ache, a gaping wound that refused to close. She would clutch it to her chest, rocking slightly, tears streaming down. Her face, a silent scream of pure, unadulterated agony. The vibrant, passionate artist who lived and breathed music was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, adrift in a sea of despair. The world outside her apartment became an alien landscape. People moved, mouths opened and closed, but no sound reached her. It was like watching a film with the volume off, a bizarre, disjointed pantomime. The cacophony she once embraced now seemed preferable to this oppressive nothingness. She began to withdraw, answering fewer calls, ignoring texts. Friends, well-meaning but utterly clueless about the depth of her despair, would attempt to visit. She'd open the door, see their sympathetic eyes, and slam it shut. Their attempts at communication, their clumsy gestures, their attempts to speak louder, which only distorted their faces and made them seem grotesque, felt like an invasion, a painful reminder of what she had lost. She couldn't explain the terror, the isolation, the sheer, paralyzing emptiness that had consumed her. How could they understand a silence so profound it was its own kind of sound, a constant, crushing pressure in her skull? Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shifting light outside her window. Elara rarely left her bed, the sheets tangled around her like a shroud. Food lost its taste, sleep brought no solace. Her once precise hands now trembled uncontrollably, a constant tremor that mirrored the earthquake that had ravaged her inner world. She would stare at the ceiling for hours, memories of soaring melodies, intricate harmonies, and rapturous applause swirling just beyond her reach. A cruel torment. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the suffocating presence of all that she had lost. A relentless tormentor that whispered of a future devoid of passion, purpose, and most terrifyingly, music. She was trapped, a living monument to a symphony that had abruptly, brutally ceased to play. The despair was a heavy cloak weighing her down, threatening to pull her into an abyss from which there seemed no escape. The apartment, once a vibrant sanctuary of sound, had transformed into a somber, dust-laden tomb, a mirror of Elara's internal landscape. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each indistinguishable from the last in its crushing monotony. The stacks of sheet music, once meticulously organized, lay scattered, yellowing at the edges, some ripped in fits of impotent rage. Her beloved violin, still pristine in its case, felt like a relic from a forgotten life, too painful to touch, too heavy to lift. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the drawn curtains, illuminating the disarray. A half-eaten plate of cold toast, an empty water glass, a crumpled tissue, silent witnesses to her slow decline. The air was thick with the scent of stale air and unspoken grief. Elara rarely left her bed. When she did, it was only to stumble to the kitchen for a glass of water, or to the bathroom, where she'd catch a glimpse of her reflection. Hollow eyes, hair tangled, skin pale. The woman who looked back was a stranger, stripped of her vibrancy, her purpose. The silence was her constant companion, not a peaceful quiet, but a roaring void that swallowed every thought, every memory, every whisper of hope. She would sit for hours, curled on the sofa, clutching a pillow to her chest, trying to remember the precise feel of a crescendo, the exact timbre of a cello's mournful sigh. But the memories, once so vivid, now felt like faint echoes, fading further with each passing day. The phantom vibrations of music would torment her, a cruel neurological trick, making her clench her fists in frustration. Her physiotherapy sessions were a purgatory of pain and futility. The therapists, kind-eyed but uncomprehending, would guide her through exercises designed to strengthen her body, to retrain her balance, skills she'd once possessed effortlessly. But without the rhythm of her internal world, without the subtle auditory cues that guided her movements, every step was a conscious, arduous effort. The pain, not just physical, but the deep, soul-crushing ache of betrayal by her own body, was constant. She'd go through the motions, her face a mask of apathy, but inside, a storm raged. The repetitive movements, the unyielding demand to push through felt pointless. What was the use of a strong body when her spirit was broken, when the very essence of who she was had been silenced? Often she would simply stop, mid-exercise, tears silently tracking paths down her cheeks, her body refusing to cooperate, her mind screaming in defiance against a world that no longer made sense. Moments of near surrender were frequent. One particularly dark evening, she found herself standing over her violin case, her hands hovering, trembling. A wild, destructive urge consumed her, to smash it, to obliterate the very object that represented her torment. She picked it up, feeling the familiar curve of the wood, the smoothness of the varnish. For a terrifying moment, her grip tightened, ready to hurl it against the wall. But then a flicker, a memory of Maestro Ivanov's face, his almost reverent handling of the instrument. The violence subsided, replaced by a deep, guttural sob that shook her entire frame. She sank to the floor, cradling the violin like a lost child, surrounded by the scattered, silent sheet music, the air thick with her despair. The instrument had become both her greatest love and her most agonizing reminder. Her few remaining friends tried, clumsily, desperately, to break through her self-imposed isolation. They would leave food outside her door, send voicemails she couldn't hear, text messages she'd glance at, but never answer. Only a handful persisted. There was Sarah, a fellow violinist, who would simply sit outside Elara's apartment door for hours, sometimes leaving a small, comforting gift, a soft blanket, a cup of her favorite tea. She understood, in a way others couldn't, the profound intimacy of Elara's relationship with sound. Maestro Ivanov, too, would occasionally appear. He never knocked, simply left new, pristine sheet music rolled and tied with a silk ribbon, placing them carefully on her doormat. No notes, no words, just the blank, challenging pages, a silent dare, a persistent echo of his unyielding belief in her. Then there was Arthur, an old friend from the conservatory, a brilliant pianist who had been blind since birth. He seemed to possess an innate understanding of Elara's new world, a shared language of altered perception. He would sometimes just appear, letting himself in with a spare key she hadn't bothered to retrieve, and simply sit with her in the oppressive silence. He wouldn't try to speak, wouldn't try to fix her. Instead, he would tap a rhythmic pattern on the floor with his foot or lightly grasp her wrist, letting her feel the subtle pulse of his own heartbeat. He taught her, through touch, the profound silence of true presence, the way the world could be experienced, not through sight or sound, but through the subtle vibrations of existence. He was a beacon of silent empathy, showing her that a world without sensory input was not necessarily a world without connection. The silence was the true antagonist. Not merely the absence of sound, but its oppressive presence, a constant, suffocating blanket that wrapped around her, infiltrating every crevice of her mind. It was a taunting, relentless force, reminding her of every lost note, every missed harmony, every forgotten melody. It permeated her dreams, turning them into silent, grotesque ballets, where figures danced without music, mouths moved without words, and instruments hung suspended, eternally unplayed. She would wake in a cold sweat, gasping for air, the profound silence of her room pressing in on her, a physical pain. Her body, once an instrument of precision and grace, felt alien, a vessel that had betrayed her. Her hands, once conduits of exquisite artistry, now trembled with disuse and despair. The perfectionist in her screamed at the chaos of her environment, the growing dust, the disarray, but the will to act, to clean, to even care, was extinguished. She was a ghost in her own home, a prisoner of a silence that was both external and deeply internal. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was an exhaustion of the soul, a weariness so profound that even breathing felt like an insurmountable effort. She was teetering on the edge, the abyss beckoning, and the few threads of connection that remained felt painfully thin, barely strong enough to hold her from slipping into complete oblivion. The world had gone quiet, and Elara, the maestro of sound, was lost within its crushing, silent embrace. The invitation had been more of an abduction. Arthur, refusing to take no for an answer, had gently but firmly coaxed Elara out of her apartment, his calm persistence unwavering. He led her through the bustling city, a silent kaleidoscope of movement and color, until they arrived at an unassuming theater tucked away on a side street. "Just feel it, Elara," he'd signed, his hands graceful and deliberate, before guiding her to a seat near the stage. The air inside was thick with anticipation, but to Elara it was merely quiet. Then the lights dimmed, not gradually, but in a sudden, jarring cut to black, making her jump. A ripple of silent anticipation ran through the audience, a sensation she felt more than saw. The performance began. It wasn't a symphony of sound, but a breathtaking ballet of vibrations, lights, and bodies moving in visceral harmony. Dancers, some visibly deaf, others hearing, moved with an astonishing fluidity, their movements responding not to music heard, but to light cues and the subtle tremors emanating from the stage floor. Giant ethereal projections of swirling colors and pulsating patterns danced across the back wall, mirroring the dancers' motions, creating a visual symphony. Elara watched, mesmerized, feeling the rhythmic thud of feet against the sprung floor, vibrating through the soles of her shoes, up her legs, and into her very core. She saw the dancers' expressions: pure joy, fierce concentration, profound sadness, all expressed through their bodies without a single audible note. Then a dancer, her back to the audience, began to move slowly. On a screen above her, a single deep note of a cello appeared as a visual waveform, expanding and contracting with each deliberate, powerful flex of the dancer's muscles. As the note deepened, the stage lights shifted to a rich, resonant indigo. Elara felt a peculiar sensation in her chest, a phantom echo of sound triggered by the visual representation and the floor's deep tremor. Another dancer joined, portraying a lighter, higher pitch, represented by a shimmering green light and faster, more delicate movements. It was music, not heard, but felt, seen, understood through a language beyond the ears. Something deep within Elara stirred. It wasn't a nostalgic pang, but a sharp, almost painful jolt of recognition. She remembered the feeling of her own violin, the wood pressed against her chin, the way its vibrations hummed through her jawbone, resonating in her skull. She remembered the subtle give of the bow on the strings, the exquisite sensation of a perfect note blossoming beneath her fingers. This wasn't a memory of sound, it was a memory of feeling sound. The dancers weren't just moving, they were embodying the very essence of musical expression, transmuting it into a new, raw, and powerfully tactile form. As the performance reached its crescendo, a chaotic yet beautiful explosion of light and movement, a symphony for the eyes and body, a thought, clear and sharp as a plucked string, pierced through the fog of Elara's despair. The music isn't gone, it's just changed its form. She felt a burning intensity ignite in her chest, a primal urge not just to create, but to feel again, to connect with that essential current of artistic expression that had defined her. It wasn't about hearing the notes anymore. It was about finding a new way to taste them, to touch them, to let them resonate through her entire being. The silence had been her enemy, but in this moment, witnessing these artists, she saw it transform into a canvas for a different kind of art. She raced home, a fierce, unyielding determination, replacing the dead weight of apathy. Arthur, sensing the shift, followed silently, his presence a comforting anchor. She tore through her apartment, ignoring the dust and disarray, her eyes fixed on the violin case. She pulled it out almost reverently, its polished surface reflecting the faint light from the window. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, its cool wood against her cheek. This time, there was no paralyzing grief, only a nascent curiosity, a spark of defiant hope. Her hands, still trembling slightly, moved with a newfound purpose. She connected her violin to a series of sensors she'd ordered months ago but never dared to use, small, disc-like devices designed to translate vibrational frequencies into light patterns and tactile feedback. It was a crude setup, an experiment in the dark, but it was a start. She placed the sensor-laden violin against her chin, the familiar curve a comfort. With a deep, shuddering breath, she drew the bow across the strings. There was no sound, only the familiar muted vibration against her jaw. But then, the small lights on the sensors glowed, first a faint red, then a warm orange, pulsing with the subtle hum of the strings. And beneath her fingers, through the grip on the bow, she felt a distinct, almost electric tremor, a tactile echo of the note. It was rough, unrefined, nowhere near the soaring melodies she once produced, but it was something. It was a connection. It was a note, not heard, but felt. And in that raw, imperfect vibration, Elara Vance felt her world, for the first time in months, begin to play again. It wasn't the beautiful, soaring symphony of her past, but a single defiant, resonant chord, the turning chord, and in that chord, a promise. She would not return to who she was, but she would be reborn. The music would find its way through her, no matter the silence. If Elara's journey from silence to finding a new voice resonates with you, imagine the transformative power of embracing your own challenges. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of extraordinary resilience. The small, raw vibration from her adapted violin was the spark Elara needed, a faint ember that with relentless dedication she fanned into a roaring flame. Her apartment, once a chamber of despair, slowly began to transform into a laboratory of innovation. The scattered sheet music was replaced by diagrams of sensor placements, wiring schematics, and notes on light sequencing. She experimented tirelessly, connecting her violin to intricate systems of LED lights that pulsed and shifted colors. With the subtle changes in her playing, she learned to choreograph her body, integrating movements that expressed the unseen melody, turning her performances into a multi-sensory experience. The silence was no longer an antagonist, but a canvas, a space where light, vibration, and motion could paint a new kind of music. Her first public performances weren't in grand concert halls, but in small, independent art spaces, often alongside other artists who communicated beyond traditional senses. Deaf dancers, visual poets, tactile sculptors. Her audience wasn't just hearing impaired, it was anyone open to experiencing art in a profoundly new way. People would sit in hushed awe, watching Elara, her violin pressed against her chin, a network of glowing lights emanating from its body and her own. They felt the low rumble of subwoofers placed strategically beneath their seats, translating the deeper notes into visceral vibrations. They saw the kaleidoscopic dance of lights that flowed from her, bow strokes, painting the air with vibrant hues. They watched her face, serene and focused, her body swaying, embodying every unseen chord, every unspoken crescendo. Elara hadn't recovered her hearing, nor did she pretend to. The silence was still there, an immutable part of her. But now it was a profound space from which her unique art emerged. She spoke openly about her journey, not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength that resonated deeply with her audience. She shared how the loss had forced her to listen to the world in a different way, to feel its rhythm, to see its hidden melodies. Her eyes, once intensely focused on a conductor or a score, now held a deep, reflective peace, observing the subtle expressions of those around her, understanding a language far older than words or sound. The transformation was profound. The perfectionist who once lived in a world of rigid musical structures now found liberation in improvisation and abstract expression. The reclusive artist, cocooned in her sorrow, became a beacon of connection, reaching out to others who felt marginalized or lost. She collaborated with sound designers who created tactile frequencies, with visual artists who projected her internal melodies onto grand screens, and with dancers who translated her silent compositions into breathtaking physical narratives. Her music, once confined to the ears, now resonated through bodies, through light, through shared empathy. Maestro Ivanov, true to his reserved nature, never openly applauded at her shows, but Elara would often catch glimpses of him in the back, a solitary figure in the dim light, his gaze fixed on her. And sometimes, after a particularly moving performance, she'd see the faint shimmer of tears in his eyes, a silent testament to his profound understanding and pride. He saw not the prodigy he had shaped, but the phoenix who had risen, transformed, from the ashes of her own ruin. Elara Vance, the violin no longer a mere instrument, but an extension of her rewired senses, closed her eyes on stage. The audience, enveloped in a strange, beautiful silence punctuated by subtle vibrations and shifting lights, held its breath. She drew her bow, not for a sound to be heard, but for a sensation to be felt. A deep, resonant tremor pulsed through the floor, a wave of indigo light bloomed across the stage, and Elara's body arched, translating the unseen note into a powerful, undeniable presence. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. The music, in its purest, most profound form, was alive. It had never left. It had simply found a new way to survive, to thrive, to move beyond the limits of sound and into the infinite landscape of the soul. Some notes don't need to be heard. They need to be felt, and the deepest ones, they never truly leave the silence.